This morning. I'm going to chair this meeting. I want to welcome first the civil society petitioner of this hearing. At the time they will be able to present themselves, and we would appreciate that you present with your names and the organizations that you represent. This is hearing number 2, and this has to do with the violations of Venezuelan migrants, violations to rights of Venezuelan migrants in Trinidad and Tobago. And we regret very much that the representative of the state of Trinidad and Tobago is not here. And this is a lost opportunity for the representatives of the state, because one of the most important purposes of these hearings is to listen both parties. And we will not have the second party. It's not possible to have a feedback on the issue that is being considered by the Commission. So I really regret that. However, I do want to recognize the civil society petitioner of this hearing for bringing this matter to the attention of the Commission. For the Commission, it's very important to follow up the humanitarian crisis that the Venezuelan people are suffering. And when we have to deal with the situation of human rights of Venezuelans in Trinidad and Tobago, that is part of our concern as well. So before I give the floor to the civil society, let me introduce the podium. Están aquí conmigo, en primer lugar.
With me, first of all, is Commissioner Antonia Urrejola. She is the commissioner who is the rapporteur for Trinidad and Tobago, among other responsibilities. Also with me, Commissioner Luis Ernesto Vargas. Vargas is the rapporteur for immigrants and migrants. And also I have Commissioner Francisco Eguiguren, who is also responsible or rapporteur for human rights defenders and judicial independence. Also, I have Senora Maria Claudia Pulido, who is the adjunct executive secretary. I will be chairing this meeting because I am the first vice president of the Commission of Human Rights, and I'm going to ask the civil society to take the floor. We don't have a time limit. It's just the hour. 1 hour we will have. I will manage the time with flexibility, just indicating when we are getting close to the time. It is important here as an opportunity to listen to what you have to say. We want to have all the possible information that will allow us to monitor this situation that you are bringing to our attention. With that said, Professor Valentin, you have the floor.
Esteemed Commissioners, the Human Rights Clinic, Faculty of Law, University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, and the Family Planning Association of Trinidad and Tobago, thank you for this important hearing. I am Rosemary Antoine, and with me are Priya Kissoon and Donna da Costa Martinez. The delegation also includes students Maris Ayong, Ajay Miraj, and Hannah Edwards Hilton. Trinidad and Tobago is the closest island to Venezuela, and in the last 2 to 3 years has experienced a dramatic increase in migrants fleeing Venezuela due to the political and economic crisis there. Many migrants seek asylum, while others remain as undocumented migrants. Our delegation contends that several human rights violations are occurring because of the failure of Trinidad and Tobago to put in place adequate, coherent, legal, policy, and administrative frameworks to treat effectively and humanely with the huge numbers of Venezuelan migrants entering its borders. Instead of formulating a humanitarian response to support this vulnerable group, the state has decreased previous protection measures, such as waivers of security bonds and orders of supervision meant to be alternatives to detention. Existing protections are being diminished without any or appropriate substitution. The state is failing to incorporate or implement international rights standards on migrants and asylum seekers as derived from various sources. Trinidad and Tobago acceded to the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and the UN Convention on Migrant Workers. Articles 125 and 27 of the American Declaration on Rights, the ICCPR, UNICEF, and CEDAW conventions are also relevant here. This perpetuates the violation of several fundamental rights. As a dualist state, incorporation into domestic law is required for treaties to have direct effect, but it is well established that ratifying states have obligations to bring the treaties into effect by adapting their domestic law in order to ensure conformity. To date, this has not occurred, such that the state is in breach of its treaty obligations. Treaty norms should also be recognized where there are gaps in existing legislation, a principle the Trinidad courts have recognized in other areas, but not for migrants and refugees. Treaties also invoke legitimate expectations. Instead, the state continues to enforce the archaic Immigration Act, which contains no provision for asylum seekers or human rights standards for migrants, ignoring the 1951 Convention and other treaties it has ratified, and forcing migrants into illegality. Refugee processes are handled by external actors, UNHCR and an NGO, Living Water. As clarified in the advisory opinion on child migrants, those states have a margin of discretion when determining their immigration policies. They are obliged to respect the human rights of all persons within their jurisdiction, including migrants, because they are based on the attributes of the human personality, irrespective of nationality, whether the person is there temporarily or in an irregular migratory situation. A 2014 national policy on refugees and asylum seekers, which follows the 1951 Convention, has not been implemented. This lack of appropriate legislation or policy hinders the application of adequate protection avenues for migrants and asylum seekers, with Venezuelans being disproportionately affected. These international obligations are either not understood or deliberately flouted. The state may also be characterized as arbitrary, uncertain, and harsh. There is little acknowledgement or awareness that migration and asylum regimes must be enveloped within a human rights framework. Consequently, uncertainty, disconnect, and incoherence permeate the administrative and judicial systems that confront Venezuelan migrants, which in turn exacerbate human rights violations. This lack of awareness filters down to the immigration, police, and even the judiciary, with reports of magistrates saying that they do not know what asylum means, thereby sentencing migrants automatically to jail. Just this week, the first case ever was won. Police tearing up asylum certificates, which are supposed to offer protection from deportation, seizing passports and charging recognized refugees with illegal entry. Operating procedures agreed with the UNHCR are not followed. Policymakers have even made statements that the state has not ratified the 1951 Convention, when indeed it has. The right to seek and receive asylum is enshrined as an individual human right, yet migrants and refugees are increasingly criminalized in Trinidad and Tobago. States are mandated to protect asylum seekers and irregular migrants from criminal prosecution. To quote Commissioner Macaulay, irregular migration is not a crime, nor is seeking asylum. The state's duty to avoid penalization of migrants and refugees, including prohibiting penalties such as detention, except as a last resort, is routinely breached. Large numbers of Venezuelans are being incarcerated in detention centers and even jails on remand for long periods, even those seeking refugee status and possessing asylum certificates. This is a violation not only of migrant and asylum rights, but the rights of persons not to be deprived of liberty. Such detentions are not, as required in international human rights law, necessary or proportionate in order to secure the appearance of the person at proceedings or to facilitate for the shortest time possible. Further, procedures and penalties are arbitrary. Some magistrates discharge, others detain for up to 4 years, others fine hefty fines up to $50,000. Bail also depends on family or social ties, which migrants do not have, and most cannot afford security bonds for release, which have been reintroduced in June 2018. Migrants are entitled to minimum due process guarantees, including proceedings to determine their status, detention reviews, hearings, translation, legal counsel, and appeals. However, the inconsistencies, legal and policy gaps result in an arbitrary, uncertain, and unfair environment for migrants, which mitigates against these due process rights in terms of administrative immigration and judicial processes. This, in turn, undermines their substantive rights. The process whereby UNHCR was allowed to make refugee status determinations is being undermined due to ad hoc detentions and deportations and clandestine operations. Decisions on deportation do not typically take into account required elements such as family ties and the humanitarian situation. Appeals or judicial review are often inaccessible. Further, immigration authorities often ignore their own processes for individualized reviews. A parliamentary committee confirmed the complaints that migrants are denied access to their attorneys and to the UNHCR in detention centers, preventing monitoring and their rights to legal representation and a fair trial. Core standards such as the principle of non-refoulement are compromised, placing migrants at risk. Some were forced to sign compulsory consents or be jailed. There is increasing xenophobia against Venezuelans and evidence of ethnic profiling. This offends the principle of non-discrimination enshrined in all human rights treaties as jus cogens norm. The current paradigm exposes significant gender dimensions, accentuating the vulnerabilities of Venezuelan migrant women in the state. We contend that gender is structurally related to race, nationality, discrimination, whereby Venezuelan women are stereotyped. These gender intersections are particularly evident with regard to sexual violence and discrimination in an environment that offers little or no protection to Venezuelan women. Women and girls who are in truth trafficked persons continue to be identified as prostitutes and illegal migrants, as opposed to victims needing state assistance and support. International standards on the rights of the child, their rights to family life, education, development, and not to be separated from parents are violated in relation to the children of Venezuelan migrants, many of whom are living in dangerous conditions without care and protection. The state's obligations to ensure that the society adopt the special measures of protection that all children require and to act in the best interests of the child are often ignored. The economic and social rights of Venezuelan migrants are being violated, in particular their rights to education, health and work, even when granted asylum. There is significant exploitation of Venezuelan nationals in the labor context because of the vulnerability of their economic and migrant status. Government introduced an amnesty through a 2-week registration process to take effect May 31st to June 14, 2019, permitting illegal Venezuelan migrants to work for up to 1 year. While a step in the right direction, the amnesty is unclear in its scope and does not go far enough. It does not release the hundreds of detained migrants or provide a mechanism which would permit Venezuelans to claim asylum, nor does it provide for due process guarantees. It specifies limited health care, contradicting statements from the Minister of Health. It excludes rights to education and completely ignores gender variables and special protections for children. Above all, the prevailing climate of xenophobia, uncertainty, and fear makes it likely that many will be afraid to come forward. This is a necessary but insufficient solution.
Officials estimate between 40 and 60,000 Venezuelans in Trinidad and Tobago, with 10,000 asylum seekers. However, local residents imagine the figures to be much higher due to reports of hundreds of Venezuelans arriving every week, their conspicuousness in communities, and the daily barrage of news and social media discussing their criminality, sexuality, and illegality. Any scan of news headlines reveals the trope of illegality that stigmatizes Venezuelans in Trinidad. Even when a boat of about 30 people capsized a few weeks ago, with 23 women and children fared drowned, the press referenced them as illegal immigrants, as if being Venezuelan was synonymous with illegal, even though they had not landed. Some even celebrated the Venezuelans' deaths. There seems to be a generalized panic amongst citizens that the small twin island state will be submerged by Venezuela's fleeing population. The fear is exacerbated by rhetoric from some officials that describes Venezuelan migrants as flooding into the country, or Venezuelan migration as a ticking time bomb. Protecting the border has included the unusual move of turning back scheduled ferries. When borders are enforced in a draconian manner, people simply take greater risks with more likelihood of exploitation, a pattern noted by the chief immigration officer, who has said that the number of Venezuelans arriving to legal ports of entry has halved, while larger numbers are arriving illegally and being detained. Of the hundreds of people in immigration detention currently, 90% are Venezuelans, deprived of their freedom, their work, and their families. A third of Venezuelans arrived with family, and more than half of the family members were children. There are estimates of about 4,000 Venezuelan children in the country who are largely unprotected, and 15 to 17-year-old unaccompanied or separated children are of particular concern. A Venezuelan mother left her 2 children in the care of her parents so she could work in Trinidad, send back remittances, and offer them a better life. The young daughter ran away from her grandparents' home, making the dangerous journey to Trinidad by boat alone. When she arrived unaccompanied, officials denied her entry, and she was returned to Venezuela, where she was intercepted by sex traffickers who promised to help her reunite with her mother. She was about 7 months pregnant when she called her mother from an unknown beach where she had been brought with others. The lack of comprehensive policies, regulations, operating procedures, and transparent processes are rampant, producing confusion and a lack of accountability, placing children at higher risks of violence, exploitation, and abuse. Some policies also perpetuate exclusion. For instance, 75% of the children who have been in Trinidad and Tobago for more than a year still did not have access to formal education. And even under the imminent registration policy for Venezuelans, children will still not have the right to education, training, or other government services. Children are also exposed to their parents' struggles and traumas. Over half of Venezuelan migrants complained about being discriminated against due to their nationality, and in 8% of these cases, people suffered physical violence. While men are increasingly stigmatized as criminals, women are labeled as hypersexual and face prejudice, discrimination, harassment, and assault. The intersections of gender and nationality make Venezuelan women prime targets, and precarious immigration status fuels the fire which has no bounds. One mother's breaking point was being aggressively propositioned in front of her young daughter while going to the grocery, and then called a Venezuelan whore when she ignored her assailants. In another case, a security guard hit a young woman who had rebuffed his advances. Emboldened by the stereotype of Venezuelan women and the vulnerability of their precarious immigration status, he ignored the facts that this person had a husband, had a toddler, she was in the late stages of her pregnancy, and that her family was living and working on the farm he was guarding. Fear and shame keep many women, particularly those with children, indoors. Verbal assaults and harassment are prolific and seemingly condoned in the absence of any recourse or support that protects the rights of women and girls, regardless of immigration status, to live free of violence and abuse. Vulnerabilities also exist within the residents. 40% of the Venezuelans with dependents rented a room only, and over 70% said their accommodation offered no privacy. For example, families with minor children may live in congested conditions, sharing a bedroom or sleeping area with unrelated people. A mother and child I visited took turns sleeping on the floor of the bedroom, so their roommate could sometimes have the bed. In another circumstance, there were 11 people, including 4 children, in an apartment sleeping on mattresses in the corridors and living room. Children are exposed to conditions of severe social and material stress and risk of abuse. While the IOM found that 2.65% of the women inside family groups they surveyed were pregnant, critically, children were pregnant in 20% of those cases. Fear of detention and deportation haunts migrants and restricts their mobility. It is especially harrowing for young mothers who worry that their detention will effectively strand or orphan their children. One woman made a contingency plan with her landlord for the care of her daughter in case she failed to return home from work. Though extreme, her fear is well-founded. A local woman recently rescued 2 Venezuelan children aged 8 and 10 she found wandering the streets after their aunt, who the children were brought with, was deported. Given the number of Venezuelan children in the country, these may not be isolated cases. Moreover, they epitomize the collateral damage of indiscriminate detention and deportation, and their fate could have been much worse. The director of the counter-trafficking unit identified an increasing number of Venezuelan nationals as victims of trafficking. People in positions of trust are also implicated. In one case, 5 people, including a pilot and 2 lawyers, were charged with the illegal adoption of a Venezuelan baby. Police and immigration officials are commonly accused of preying on Venezuelan women, and only isolated cases have been prosecuted. A Venezuelan activist claimed, "They pay the men to buy the girls and keep them trafficking all over the place. How you expect to tell Venezuelans to go and make a report to the police? And you know when you go to the police, they put you in jail and beat you down, and they throw in the cell and cursing you." Over the past year, the following news reports corroborate migrants' claims. 4 Venezuelan women were held captive and raped in a house painted to resemble a police station. A police officer is committed to stand trial for human trafficking. Another special reserve police officer was amongst 4 men arrested for kidnapping a Venezuelan woman. During a rights protest and petition to the government to hear their pleas for help, a young Venezuelan woman told the television news about her ordeal as a victim of a sex trafficking ring with ties to a local police station. And immigration officers are accused of demanding money from families seeking to visit detainees and sexually abusing male and female detainees, which the National Security Minister promised to investigate. Finally, Venezuelans describe police barging into their private dwellings, subjecting them to racial profiling and document checks, showing disdain or disregard for asylum seeker or refugee status, and subjecting them to fines and detention while also failing to communicate effectively their rights in the process. Moreover, they claim their ability to address their legal rights are obstructed when phone calls are denied or limited, and when they are moved between police stations or between prisons, including maximum security prison, without informing the UNHCR, their lawyers, or family. The following detention conditions were noted in Parliament. Medical complaints and referrals were addressed slowly, which complicated injuries and untreated conditions. And at a point, pregnant women were in detention for weeks without medical care. There was no provision for psychological counseling or counseling related to deportation. There was an insufficient and poor quality diet, limited drinking water, poor sanitation and hygiene, and limited exposure to daylight and fresh air for only 1 to 2 hours per day on fair days. Phone calls were restricted. Children couldn't visit the center to see parents. Recognized refugees were detained amongst hundreds of others who were registered asylum seekers or intending to seek asylum. Intentions to claim asylum were not referred to the UNHCR. International rights organizations, as well as the UNHCR, had difficulty accessing detention centers. There was a lack of interpreters on staff to help migrants communicate their needs and issues, and no independent investigations were conducted when staff were accused of bullying or brutality, all of which just scratch the surface of the Venezuelan experience in Trinidad and Tobago. Strengthening the rights regime of the state is a coordinated multi-stakeholder effort, and on the rare occasion when the state condemns xenophobia and hate speech and exploitation, as it did in the newspapers yesterday, it is an encouraging sign that we can work collaboratively towards rights-based sustainable development for the nation. In public spaces, private places, in institutions and the media, recognizing the humanity of the non-national will help us to recognize our own humanity.
Since 1956, the Family Planning Association of Trinidad and Tobago.
Desde 1956, una ONG trabaja para hacer reconocer los derechos. FPAT consiste de 5 clínicas, incluso 4 estáticas y una móvil, sirviendo 7,000 clientes que benefician de 78,000 servicios de reproducción. Nuestras clínicas promueven un servicio de calidad para servir a grupos marginalizados.
Groups, including but not limited to Venezuelans. Since then, we've established ourselves as providers of safe, non-stigmatizing and non-discriminating spaces to access healthcare services delivered by trusted, reliable healthcare providers, meeting needs not provided or provided inadequately by the state. Additionally, FPAT undertakes outreach services delivered through our 40-feet mobile clinic, which is outfitted to provide a cadre of sexual and reproductive health services, and/or we work with clients to identify a space at the client's location. In addition to direct clinic services, in order to reach migrants, FPAT uses a peer-to-peer engagement system, using peers who are either trusted associates or who are members of migrant groups. These peers act as conduits to build and bridge the demand and access to life-saving sexual and reproductive health services. Peer navigation is a positive health-seeking body system, whereby an HIV-positive client, for example, is assigned a navigator who works with the patient to enroll into an established treatment site and to remain adherent to their prescribed treatment plan. In addition to supporting access to medical services and support, the Peer Navigator/Educator, PNE, provides basic psychosocial support, which will include being a confidant, advocate, life coach, and providing technical direction to attain welfare support where needed. Coupled with the PNE is a migrant liaison, someone from the migrant population that they identify with, are able to communicate with in their own language and parlance, and have their needs heard and documented. The migrant liaison is the first line of interaction at FPAT. This interaction allows for the building of trust and makes the delivery of service easier for both client and practitioner. When needed, the migrant liaison also expedites emergency cases to facilitate quick decisions and/or action. These strategies have facilitated efficient service and quickly fed through the migrant social networks, and within a short period of time, FPAT was deemed a trusted service provider. Through these mechanisms, we have been able to be both a first-hand observer and service provider for the influx of Venezuelan migrants in Trinidad and Tobago. Good health and well-being is an important concern in the Venezuelan migrant scenario. FPAT has seen firsthand that although Trinidad and Tobago provides an open-door public health system, access to basic medical care by migrants is often met with difficulty. In situations where secondary health care is needed, even with emergency cases, the situation is worse as access is limited or denied because of the patient's migrant status. The World Health Organization contends that there is a common misconception of an association between migration and the importation of diseases, particularly infectious diseases. In fact, the health problems of migrants are similar to the rest of the population. What is true, however, is that the rates of some of these health issues may present with higher prevalence among migrants because they now live in a host country under more vulnerable conditions. Significantly, FPAT has documented that Venezuelan female migrants are more vulnerable to sexual and reproductive health problems and exposure to violence, including sexual violence. Johanna Doe is a Venezuelan migrant that fled to Trinidad and Tobago with her husband, seeking asylum, resettlement in another country for better quality of life. She lives on a farm in a rural part of Trinidad, awaiting resettlement in another country. She and her husband are usually alone, and word traveled that they are illegal Venezuelans staying on the farm and garden. One night, a group of men charged their residence, violently battered the husband, and took Johanna away, where she was gang raped and returned to their residence. Johanna and her husband contacted their satellite leader, a trusted Venezuelan, for assistance. The satellite leader contacted FPAT's migrant liaison, who immediately actioned our emergency protocol. This included direct transport to and from our clinic, emergency sexual and reproductive health services, including post-exposure prophylaxis, delivered through FPAT's MOU with an HIV treatment site, sexually transmitted infection screens, counseling, and other psychosocial support services. Johanna Doe's case is one example of what seems to be an increasing occurrence and reality. FPAT has received many such cases of women being grievously sexually assaulted. FPAT attempted to provide support to Johanna to make a police report. However, Johanna was fearful of being treated as the person who inflicted harm instead of the victim. Part of this fear was the fear of being deported, sent back to a situation that she ran from in the first place. So, to avoid the risk of making a bad situation worse, from Johanna's standpoint, silence appears to be the safer path. She was also fearful of and adamant that her husband not be made aware that she was sexually assaulted. Preface on these realities, and because of the structural obstacles faced by Venezuelan migrants wanting to access services for their most important sexual and reproductive health issues, HIV/AIDS, cervical cancer, gender-based violence, prostate cancer, gonorrhea, and chlamydia, FPAT provides life-saving responses to Venezuelan migrants, a population that is currently grossly underserved. While a statement from the Minister of Health declared that migrants were free to access public health services, the reality is that no mechanisms are in place to ensure that migrants who do so are not persecuted, prosecuted, deported, or even detained when they do so by the police because of their current illegal status. This is ultimately why they turned to FPAT. Through the support of international agencies, FPAT was able to deliver these life-saving services to Venezuelan migrants in Trinidad in the period October to December 2018 and January to March 2019. During our project period, our clinic served 462 Venezuelan migrants, and we delivered more than 1,446 sexual and reproductive health services. These positive health outcomes did not present without challenges. Migrants continue to present at our clinics with medical and social situations that we currently cannot support. In response, we've continued to liaise with other agencies to prompt a referral pathway in the best attempt to respond to the presenting situations. Unfortunately, the jobs that they hold here present less than humane terms and conditions, and time off is not easily obtained. To enable access to our services, we had to create special clinic times. Hosting clinics after work hours creates opportunities to access health services that otherwise they would not have been able to get. Our experience tells us that the state needs to establish adequate mechanisms to treat effectively with these issues, given that the NGO sector is not able to completely provide the services needed, at least in a sustainable manner. The impact of migration on children is far-reaching. FPAT's experience is that many Venezuelan migrants migrate with their children. As FPAT has become a preferred health service provider, many Venezuelan parents opt to present at our clinics seeking health services for their children. Due to the parameters of FPAT's current migrant project, we are extremely restricted with the services and support that we may provide to Venezuelan migrant children. This is a significant program deficit, as many presenting children are afflicted with medical conditions that require immediate health care and/or secondary health care services. Many of the presenting children have not seen a doctor since birth, so they do not have their full complement of required vaccinations. Some of the children are already afflicted with non-communicable diseases and associated medical conditions, including diabetes, malnutrition, vision impairment, and hearing problems. State support is needed. We have observed that many children are affected by violence, physical and sexual, perpetrated sometimes by persons they trust, and state responses are poor, if existent. As a migrant, vulnerability increases. However, being a child and being a migrant with a language barrier catalyzes that vulnerability. Consequently, migrant children are among the most critical segments of the Venezuelan migrant population that require immediate support to enable them to enjoy basic rights. FPAT is well positioned to continue serving the migrant population. However, greater efforts are needed to institute an adequate national impact. It is only through strategic partnerships, relationships, and meaningful collaborations that we will be able to holistically address the health needs of migrants in Trinidad and Tobago. Edmund Burke said, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." This is the time to efficiently appropriate resources, to focus on structure versus stricture, and to allow passion and compassion to lead programmatic delivery. Migrants are not numbers. They too are human beings, deserving the same respect and human rights that we so justly fight for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have to begin by recognizing the petition that was filed by the International Human Rights Law Clinic of the University of the West Indies, led by Professor Belantoine, former member of the Inter-American Commission and former president of the Inter-American Commission. The issue that you have brought to us has made visible a hidden face of a humanitarian crisis that Venezuelans are suffering, but also a hidden face of the migration crisis that the hemisphere and the world is suffering. I will keep my comments for the end. I want to give now the floor to my colleague commissioners, and then I'll intervene again. You want to add something?
We did have a video, but I know you were generous with our time, so it'll be up to you. It's just 1 minute long, if you wish.
Yes, let's go with the video, and then we'll respond.
Mi nombre es Denny Ventura Alcalá, soy refugiado. Me encontraba en una residencia en...
I was in a residence in San Juan where I was kidnapped practically by the police. They were entered violently with no documentation, and then they took me to the police station where I was sentenced, and they took me to court where the judge determined that I should apply for asylum, and this is what I have here. Then they took 4 months in prison, in maximum security prison, and then later they took me to another institution for 6 months. So I was for a whole year, 8 months and 2 days in prison with no right to anything. Nobody did anything for me. So I can testify that in Chawana court, they do things that are not right, that it goes against the moral and ethical principles of a legal professional. And they are sent, the prisoners are sent there to pay a fine instead of taking them somewhere else. And they do that with people from Venezuela. I'm asking you to consider that, to consider the people from Venezuela, immigrants who are escaping from a terrible situation in Venezuela.
Thank you. La comisionada Urrejola, por favor.
Well, first of all, I also want to thank you for bringing this issue to the Commission. To be honest, I'm quite overwhelmed with what I have heard. I agree with Commissioner Joel that you have put in front of us a situation that is not on the public face. As a rapporteur of Trinidad and Tobago, it's very disappointing that the state is not here today. What we have heard today, the testimonies I have heard, especially personally regarding, the situation of children. You gave a few examples of testimonies that are really overwhelming. I mean, one tries to imagine the situation of those parents, those mothers, and it's overwhelming. Overwhelming. I really regret the state is not here today. I think it was a very good opportunity to be able to discuss the situation. I can understand that for the state of Trinidad and Tobago to have this number of migrants from Venezuela is not easy. It is a problem. I assume also that you have a problem with the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. I mean, it's a situation we see in every other country in the region, and I can understand that. But it's unfortunate that the state missed an opportunity to discuss and see how we can work together on a humanitarian crisis. I have a lot of questions, but to be honest, the questions are not for you, it's for the state. So really, I would like to send a message to the state of Trinidad. It's very unfortunate that they are not here today, especially when we're doing the hearings in Jamaica. The Commission decided it was a great opportunity to do hearings in a Caribbean country, especially because we wanted to be nearer the Caribbean countries and the Caribbean states. So really my statement has to do with the absence of the state today. And the questions I have, I will like to discuss them with my fellow commissioners to send a letter of Article 41. I think we have to do this after this hearing. And I want to thank you again for all the precious information you have given us, to put it in front of the international community. And you have engaged us. I think I can talk for the rest of the commissioners. I think we have to be more proactive on the situation of the Venezuelans in Trinidad and Tobago. So thank you very much.
Gracias, comisionada. Comisionado Vargas.
Sí, muchas gracias.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank Professor Antoine for the investigation that is being carried out at the university, as well as the representatives of civil society. I would like to join my voice to expressing my regret about this empty seat of a state that should have been here to answer to these serious, documented crisis, dramatic situation with regard to Venezuelan migrants who have been coming into Trinidad and Tobago for the violation of their rights in such a flagrant way. Furthermore, in this state of vulnerability, which for years we have been insisting is the state of the entire migrant population, we have also been issuing warnings on hate speech. which has been coming from the #1 superpower in the world, the United States. Hate speech which really has an impact on the entire Americas, and we're seeing this in a very significant way. This is giving rise to xenophobic policies, which day by day are more and more serious and dramatic. And this, unfortunately, in spite of the fact that the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has been speaking about this, and this is why we regret hearing what you have presented to us today, which reflect unequivocally that we are not mistaken when we say there isn't a population that is more vulnerable than the migrant population, and in this case the Venezuelan migrant population, of course. The situation, this double moral of a government which is using the Venezuelan crisis for its own benefit, but is doing absolutely nothing to try to remedy these serious situations against Venezuelan migrants, but for their own interests. It's good for them to be involved in this drama involving Venezuelan migrants, but they themselves are doing nothing. I heard the story of Joanna Doe and all that you have narrated to us in general, because there's a lot that you have spoken to us. I hope that this will go to the Permanent Council. There has been so much discussion on the situation of Venezuela. Why then is there no interest in Venezuelan migrants and their situation? Because there are human rights violations in other countries. Why then are they not interested in the violation of the sexual and reproductive rights of women? That this is happening with girls, Venezuelan girls and adolescents, members of families who are separated from the rest of their families, and even because of the U.S. public policy, which we are hearing about more and more every day, who have the cynicism to say that they are interested in the Venezuelan situation. They are not interested in the Venezuelan situation or Venezuelans. They are interested in other things of an economic and other nature. But this is a perverse situation of the drama involving Venezuelans for specific interests, personal interests, without dealing with and overcoming the situation. This is a pity, because as Commissioner Antonia said, that we have very specific questions for the state of Trinidad and Tobago, and this is why we regret that they are not present today. And I am drawn to the fact of the blood strike which has taken place in this country, and which denotes that this is an extremely serious situation and which nobody wants to give attention to. I'm also drawn by the fact that there are state authorities in Trinidad and Tobago, starting with the judges, who express ignorance with regard to definitions which are included in international and American standards, and which, even if you Google, they would see that they need to be applied. the police and officials who should be seeing to the protection of Venezuelan citizens and migrants as persons who arrive are even suspicious with regard to what is happening. When we look at a leader, Pope Francis, who is so popular, and this symbolic speech he made at the start of the year of the need for us to practice asylum given to persons. We're not even interested. It's not important to us to see whether they're being practiced. In spite of what the Pope has said, nothing is being done. So I think that this is very painful. It's very painful to listen to all of this. And of course, we have to include this in the final report this year of the Commission, Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, with regard to the fact that the state of Trinidad and Tobago did not accept the invitation to be present in order for us to overcome and find solutions to the situation. I thank you very much that you were interested enough to come and speak about the situation on behalf of Venezuelan migrants, and I hope that this will be referred to the Permanent Council of the OAS for them to be apprised of this human rights situation. The topic of migrants in general, and in particular Venezuelan migrants, should be seen from the point of view of the recognition of their human rights, and this should allow us to advance and move the situation forward. But we are taking backward steps with the little that we have been able to achieve. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Commissioner Eguiguren. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I didn't intend to make a comment, but I am the rapporteur for Venezuela, among other things. And so I was very interested in this hearing. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the International Human Rights Clinic of the University of the West Indies for providing us with this well-documented information and other information that they've provided. As my colleagues have said, we feel even more the absence of the state when we have heard all that you have had to say. With all this valuable information without an answer, and the Commission is used to using expressions like "we regret" and "we are concerned." I am not going to regret, but question, repudiate the absence of the state of Trinidad and Tobago. I don't know their reasons, but there's no explanation, there's no excuse. The Commission has come from far because they wanted to be closer to the countries of the Caribbean. They've spent money, and we have spent our time, and it's very bad that for the first two hearings in this room, the state of Nicaragua, first of all, and then the state of Trinidad and Tobago did not present themselves here. And so I think we need to be severe. And no doubt this will be included in our final report But I think it is time for the Permanent Council of the OAS draw the attention of the states for them to comply with their obligations, and that they would be absent from hearings which they've known about for a long time. The migration troubles or presents problems on a day-to-day basis for states, but there is support, and we are indignant about the fact that a state which is so physically close to the hearings with regard to these poor persons who are suffering this and who are expecting and hoping for a better situation are not here. It's indignant. I'm indignant at the absence of the state from these hearings. Thank you very much, Commissioner. We have come to the end of our time. However, if you will allow me, I would just like to say a few words, because I am just as indignant and saddened over and beyond the absence of the state in the face of this humanitarian crisis which you have presented to us. I recognize the work and acknowledge the work of the International Human Rights Clinic of the University of the West Indies. I'd also like to acknowledge the work being done by FBA in favor of migrants, in favor of persons who need assistance, and for persons who have not found support in authorities to be able to survive in situations that are really terrible situations. My colleagues have expressed their indignation at the absence of the states, but I would like to focus on the measures that we can take jointly, civil society along with the Inter-American Commission. The Commission has the responsibility to monitor the human rights situation in the region, but it also has within its scope other instruments for the defense and protection of human rights. Here, you know, and are aware of this, Professor Antoine and the clinic can implement several measures, such as the request for precautionary measures for the protection of the physical integrity of victims who find themselves in situations of risk. Also, listening to the dramatic cases which you have described, I see violations of the American Convention on Human Rights as well as the American Declaration, and so cases can be brought before the Commission. Commissioner Orejola spoke about the importance of sending letter in keeping with Article 41 of the Convention, to which I think is the first step we should take. In May 2018, we requested that information, and to date we have not received a reply. We cannot lose sight of the fact that Trinidad and Tobago is a member state of the OAS. Trinidad and Tobago falls within the competence of the Inter-American Commission, and the Commission has within its legal basis the American Declaration on the Rights and Duties of Man, and this gives us competence to act fully in this situation. If you would like to make some concluding remarks, we have 3 more minutes, if that is necessary.
We would just like to thank you for your very comprehensive responses, and we feel very encouraged, because it's not a simple thing, an easy thing to come out with these sorts of, and it has been a multidisciplinary effort and an ongoing effort, including the students from the clinic, and we look forward to the Article 41 letter. I think that's a very good measure, and I hope that this hearing can be, let us say, a jump start, because we did talk about the amnesty, so they have started, but we have shown how inadequate that would be when we consider all of the issues. So we want to move forward in a collaborative way, the clinic and FBAT, to work with the state and with the Commission to be able to solve or bring some sort of alleviation to these problems. So thank you very much once again for the hearing.
Muchas gracias. La audiencia está por terminar.
Thank you very much. The hearing is closed.